Imagine removing one everyday object from your life tomorrow, your shoes, not just for a walk across the grass, but for every journey you take, across soil, stone, sand, and cold earth. For most people today, that idea feels uncomfortable almost immediately. Yet for the overwhelming majority of human history, this was simply normal. Human feet were not separated from the ground by rubber, leather, or fabric. They felt the landscape directly with every step. For countless generations, the surface of the earth was not something distant from the body. It was something constantly touched. So if most humans once lived this way, what does that long, quiet relationship between the human foot and the ground reveal about our past? And why was 90% of human history spent barefoot? For most people today, the act of putting on shoes happens almost automatically. It is one of the first small rituals before stepping outside the home. The floor of a house may be soft and clean, but beyond the door there are streets, sidewalks, gravel paths, and cold surfaces. Shoes create a thin but constant barrier between the body and the world beneath it. Because this habit begins early in life, many people grow up rarely thinking about the ground they walk on. The earth becomes something distant, something felt only through layers of rubber, leather, or fabric. Yet if we step back and look across the full span of human history, this modern habit occupies only a very small portion of time. For the overwhelming majority of our species' existence, human beings moved across the planet without that barrier. The human foot touched the ground directly. This was not unusual. It was simply how life was lived. The story of the barefoot human begins long before cities, long before roads, and long before the invention of most objects we now consider ordinary. Long before written history, the ancestors of modern humans were already walking across landscapes that stretched far beyond the horizon. In those early periods, survival depended on movement. Small groups traveled across grasslands, river valleys, and forest edges in search of food and water. Movement was not occasional. It was part of daily life. Each journey left traces on the land, though most of those traces vanished quickly under wind, rain, and time. What remained constant, however, was the simple contact between the human foot and the ground. The surfaces early humans walked upon were not smooth and predictable like modern pavement. They were varied and often uneven. Soil could be soft after rain or hard under the sun. Riverbanks might be muddy. Grasslands could hide stones beneath thin layers of dirt. Sand shifted under each step. Forest floors were covered with leaves and roots. To move across such terrain required balance, attention, and a body adapted to walking long distances. The human foot developed within exactly these conditions. Its shape, with its arch and flexible structure, formed over long periods of evolutionary time. This structure allowed early humans to walk, stand, and travel efficiently across natural ground. The soles of the feet gradually strengthened through constant contact with the earth. Skin thickened in response to repeated pressure. Muscles and tendons supported the body's weight during long journeys. None of these adaptations required shoes, because the environment in which the human body evolved did not include them. Archaeology offers quiet hints of this long, barefoot past. In rare places where ancient footprints were preserved in soft ground that later hardened into stone, researchers have found evidence of humans walking thousands of years ago. These footprints appear along riverbanks, near ancient lakes, and in caves where sediment once captured the shape of a step before slowly solidifying. When scientists study these traces, they see the clear outlines of toes, arches, and heels pressing directly into the earth. The marks show movement, sometimes in groups, sometimes alone. They show adults and children traveling across landscapes together. What they do not show is the shape of footwear. The impressions belong to bare human feet. These rare discoveries do not represent the entire story of human movement, but they provide small windows into how people once interacted with the ground beneath them. They remind us that the relationship between the human body and the earth is far older than many modern habits. When we measure time in thousands of years, the age of shoes appears surprisingly recent. When we measure time in hundreds of thousands of years, it becomes even smaller. For most of human history, the human foot was not protected by manufactured materials. Instead, it was part of the landscape itself, responding directly to every surface it encountered. The beginning of our story, therefore, does not start with shoes at all. It begins with something much simpler: the quiet contact between the human body and the ground beneath it, repeated step after step across an ancient world that had never yet seen a pair of shoes. When modern people think about movement across the landscape, it is often imagined as something planned and limited: a short walk to a nearby place, a path through a park, a sidewalk between buildings. These movements happen within environments that have already been shaped and softened for human use. Surfaces are flattened, paved, or carefully maintained. The ground becomes predictable. Yet for most of human history, movement happened within environments that were not arranged for comfort. The world that early humans walked through was a living landscape, shaped by weather, animals, rivers, and seasons rather than by human design. Across much of Africa, where the earliest members of our species evolved, the land was composed of open savannas mixed with patches of woodland and water sources that changed with rainfall. These environments encouraged movement. Food resources were often scattered rather than concentrated in one place. Small groups of humans followed seasonal patterns of plants and animals, traveling across familiar territories that stretched across many miles. In such conditions, walking was not a single event during the day. It was woven into daily survival. The human body became accustomed to covering ground slowly and steadily over time. Without shoes, every step carried information from the ground to the body. The texture of the earth could be felt directly through the skin of the feet. Fine sand moved beneath the toes. Hardened soil created firm resistance. Small stones or roots required subtle adjustments in balance. These sensations were not merely discomforts to be avoided. They were part of the continuous communication between body and landscape. The foot, with its network of bones, tendons, and sensory nerves, responded to these small changes in surface. When the ground sloped or shifted, the body adjusted automatically. Muscles in the foot and lower leg responded to keep balance stable. Over long periods of time, this constant interaction helped shape how humans walked and stood. Even today, the human foot contains more than 24 bones and a complex arrangement of joints and ligaments that allow it to bend, flex, and absorb impact. This structure did not appear suddenly. It developed gradually as early humans adapted to life on two legs while moving across natural terrain. The arch of the foot helps distribute body weight while walking or running. The heel absorbs the initial impact of each step. The toes assist in balance and forward motion. These features allowed early humans to travel long distances efficiently, something that became an important advantage in environments where food sources were spread across wide areas. In this sense, the human foot can be understood as part of a larger evolutionary story about endurance. Unlike many animals that rely on bursts of speed, humans developed the ability to move steadily across great distances. This pattern of movement is visible not only in skeletal structures but also in the archaeological record. Researchers studying ancient landscapes sometimes find traces that suggest repeated human travel routes along rivers, lake shores, and open plains. These routes were not paved roads but natural corridors shaped by water, vegetation, and animal migrations. Within these corridors, people walked again and again across the same ground over generations. During most of this time, footwear either did not exist or was used only in limited situations. The surfaces people walked upon, therefore, remained part of everyday physical experience. The ground beneath the foot was not hidden or distant. It was directly felt through every step taken during daily movement. When viewed across hundreds of thousands of years, this relationship between the human body and the land becomes one of the most consistent elements of human life. Long before cities and roads appeared, humans were already travelers across varied landscapes, guided by memory, observation, and the slow rhythm of walking. Each step left only temporary marks on the earth, but together those countless steps formed the quiet foundation of human history. The deeper we look into early human history, the more movement begins to appear as one of its most consistent patterns. Long before permanent villages or cultivated fields, human groups lived in ways that required constant awareness of the land around them. The rhythm of life was closely tied to the availability of water, plants, and animals. When the environment changed with the seasons, people moved with it. In these early periods, the landscape itself served as both guide and pathway. Rivers created natural routes through valleys. Open grasslands allowed long lines of sight across the horizon. Forest edges provided shelter and food. Across these varied environments, walking became the primary method through which humans explored, survived, and connected different places. Within this pattern of movement, the human foot remained in continuous contact with the surface of the earth. Without shoes, each step responded to the shape and texture of the ground. Soft soil absorbed the weight of the body. Hard stone returned that pressure upward through the heel and arch. Even small changes in terrain influenced how the body adjusted its balance and posture. This quiet interaction between foot and ground happened thousands of times each day as people traveled across familiar territories. Over long periods, such repeated contact formed a stable relationship between the human body and the environment it inhabited. The human foot itself reflects this long history. It contains a structure that allows both strength and flexibility, supporting the body during long periods of standing and walking. The arch helps distribute weight, while ligaments and tendons store and release small amounts of energy during each step. These features are not unique to modern people. They are shared across the species and can be seen in skeletal remains from ancient populations. The design of the human foot suggests that it evolved under conditions where direct contact with the ground was a normal part of daily life. Early humans did not move through environments that were separated from the body by manufactured layers. Instead, their bodies were continuously responding to natural surfaces shaped by climate and geology. Evidence of this relationship sometimes appears in places where the earth briefly preserved the shape of human steps. In a few rare locations, ancient footprints have been discovered in sediments that later hardened into stone. These prints show individuals walking across soft ground near water sources, leaving impressions of toes and heels that remained long after the people themselves had disappeared. When researchers study such traces, they are careful not to assume too much about the lives of the individuals who left them. However, the prints still reveal something simple and important. They show how human feet once pressed directly into the earth, step after step, without the outline of footwear between skin and soil. These moments preserved in the ground provide small reminders of how ordinary barefoot movement once was. For countless generations, the boundary between body and landscape remained thin. The ground could be warm beneath the sun or cool in the early morning. It could be rough, smooth, damp, or dry. All of these variations were part of the daily sensory world experienced through the feet. When we look back across the long arc of human time, this pattern becomes striking. The age of roads, sidewalks, and constant footwear is very recent compared with the deep past of our species. For most of human history, walking barefoot was not a special activity or a deliberate choice. It was simply the normal way humans moved across the earth, guided by the slow rhythm of steps that connected the human body to the landscapes where our story first began. If we look closely at the human foot, it begins to reveal something quiet but important about the long past of our species. At first glance, the foot may appear simple, only a structure that supports the body while standing or walking. Yet inside it lies a complex arrangement of bones, joints, ligaments, and muscles that work together with remarkable coordination. Each step that a person takes involves small movements within this structure, movements that absorb impact, maintain balance, and help the body move forward across the ground. This design did not appear suddenly. It formed gradually over a long period of evolutionary time as early humans adapted to life on two legs. Walking upright, known as bipedal movement, changed the way weight traveled through the human body. Instead of being distributed across 4 limbs, the entire body had to balance above 2 feet. The foot, therefore, became both a support structure and a tool for movement. The heel strikes the ground first during a typical step, receiving the initial force of contact. The arch then helps distribute body weight along the length of the foot. Finally, the toes assist in pushing the body forward as the next step begins. This sequence happens so naturally that most people rarely notice it, yet it represents the result of countless generations of gradual biological adjustment. One of the most distinctive features of the human foot is its arch. Unlike the flat feet of many primates that spend large amounts of time climbing trees, the human foot contains a curved structure that acts somewhat like a spring. When weight presses downward during walking, The arch compresses slightly and then returns to its original shape as the foot lifts from the ground. This process helps manage the repeated forces created by walking long distances. Over the course of a single day, the human body may take thousands of steps. Across a lifetime, that number grows into the millions. The arch allows these repeated movements to occur with greater efficiency. Another feature that reflects the walking history of our species is the alignment of the big toe. In humans, the big toe sits in line with the other toes and helps push the body forward during the final phase of each step. In contrast, many other primates possess a more flexible big toe that can grasp branches while climbing. The human arrangement favors stability during forward movement across the ground. This difference provides one of the clues that our ancestors spent increasing amounts of time traveling on land rather than moving through trees. The structure of the foot, therefore, carries traces of an ancient transition in the way our ancestors moved through their environment. These anatomical features developed in a world where direct contact with the ground was a normal part of daily movement. The skin on the sole of the foot is thicker than the skin found on many other parts of the body. Beneath that skin lies a layer of tissue that helps cushion impact when the foot meets the earth. At the same time, the foot remains sensitive enough to detect subtle differences in surface texture. Nerve endings allow the body to sense pressure, temperature, and small shifts in balance. This sensory feedback helps guide each step, allowing the body to respond quickly when the ground changes beneath it. When scientists study the bones of ancient human relatives, they often observe similar structures in the feet that suggest long periods of upright walking. These skeletal features appear in fossils associated with early members of the human lineage. Although the environments they lived in were different from those of today, the general pattern remains consistent. The human foot evolved as part of a body adapted to traveling across natural terrain. For most of that long history, there is no evidence that footwear separated the foot from the ground. Instead, the biological design of the foot developed in direct interaction with the surfaces early humans walked upon. In this way, the human foot becomes more than just a part of the body. It becomes a quiet record of how our species first moved through the world, step by step across landscapes that existed long before shoes were ever imagined. The human foot does more than simply hold the body upright. It also acts as a quiet mediator between the body and the surface of the earth. Each time the foot touches the ground, a flow of information travels upward through nerves and muscles. Pressure shifts slightly from heel to arch to toes. The body senses whether the surface is firm or soft, level or uneven. These signals happen quickly and mostly without conscious attention, allowing a person to move smoothly across changing terrain. This process may seem ordinary today, but it reflects a long history in which the human body adapted to walking directly on natural ground. Inside the foot are many small joints that allow subtle adjustments during each step. These joints allow the foot to bend slightly when encountering a stone or slope, helping maintain balance. The toes spread and contract in response to the shape of the ground. Ligaments and tendons coordinate these movements so that the body remains stable even when surfaces are irregular. When walking across soil, sand, or grass, the foot naturally adapts to the changing texture beneath it. These small adjustments protect the body from sudden shifts in balance and help distribute pressure across the sole. Such flexibility becomes especially important when movement takes place across landscapes that have not been flattened or paved. The natural ground surfaces that early humans walked across were often unpredictable. Rain could soften the soil in one place while leaving nearby areas firm. Riverbanks might contain patches of mud that shifted underfoot. Grasslands could hide stones beneath vegetation. Without modern footwear, the body depended on the responsiveness of the foot itself. The foot structure allowed humans to remain stable even while traveling through varied environments. Another element of this system lies in the network of nerves located in the sole of the foot. These nerves allow the body to sense small changes in pressure and texture. Even slight differences in the surface beneath the foot can be detected through these sensory pathways. This ability helps the body maintain balance during walking and standing. When the ground tilts or becomes uneven, the nervous system responds by adjusting posture and muscle tension. Such responses often happen automatically without deliberate thought. In environments where the ground changes frequently, this sensory awareness becomes especially valuable. The design of the foot also works together with the muscles of the lower leg. When the heel contacts the ground, Muscles along the back of the leg help absorb impact and guide the body forward. The arch then helps manage the weight of the body as it moves across the foot. Finally, the toes assist in pushing the body into the next step. This coordinated sequence repeats thousands of times during a typical day of walking. Over long periods, such patterns of movement shaped the physical endurance that became characteristic of human mobility. The connection between foot structure and long-distance movement has attracted the attention of scientists studying human evolution. Researchers have observed that humans possess several features that support steady travel across landscapes. These include strong ligaments in the foot, a stable heel structure, and an arch capable of managing repeated pressure during walking or running. Together, these features allow humans to move efficiently across long distances without relying on sudden bursts of speed. This pattern of endurance movement likely played an important role in how early humans explored and inhabited different environments. When considering these anatomical features, it becomes clear that the human foot developed in close interaction with natural ground surfaces. The bones, muscles, and sensory systems of the foot formed within conditions where direct contact with the earth was normal. Shoes, which now separate the foot from the ground in many modern societies, appeared relatively late in the human story. For much of the time during which the human body evolved, the foot experienced the textures of soil, sand, and stone directly. In this sense, the structure of the human foot can be seen as a quiet reflection of that long period when the human body moved through the world barefoot, guided by the constant dialogue between skin and ground. When scientists study the bones of the human foot, they often notice that its structure reflects both strength and flexibility at the same time. This balance allows the foot to support the full weight of the body while still adjusting to uneven ground. Unlike rigid structures that can only move in limited ways, the human foot contains many small elements that work together to manage pressure during movement. There are more than 24 bones within the foot alone, connected through joints that allow subtle shifts in position as the body walks or stands. These bones form a structure that can bend slightly when weight presses downward and then return to its original shape as the foot lifts again. Over the course of thousands of steps, this repeated pattern distributes the forces created by walking across the entire foot rather than concentrating pressure in one place. Ligaments hold the bones together and help maintain the shape of the arch. Tendons connect muscles from the lower leg to the foot, allowing the body to control the movement of the toes and stabilize the ankle during each step. Together, these components form a system that is capable of both stability and adaptation. When the foot lands on solid ground, it provides a stable base for the body. When the surface changes, the foot can shift slightly to maintain balance. This adaptability becomes especially important when traveling across natural terrain where surfaces rarely remain perfectly level. The arch of the foot plays a central role in this system. Acting somewhat like a curved bridge, it helps distribute the body's weight from the heel toward the front of the foot. During walking, the arch compresses slightly under pressure and then rebounds as the foot lifts. This motion allows the foot to absorb some of the force created when the body moves forward. Over time, such efficiency becomes important for a species that relies on steady movement across long distances. Early human groups often traveled across landscapes in search of food, water, and shelter. Movement was not always fast, but it was frequent. The body therefore benefited from structures that allowed repeated walking with reduced strain. Another feature that supports this pattern is the wide arrangement of the toes. When standing or walking barefoot on natural surfaces, the toes can spread slightly to increase stability. This spreading helps the body maintain balance when the ground slopes or shifts. In contrast to animals whose feet function primarily as hooves or paws, the human foot allows a range of subtle adjustments that assist with upright posture. These small adjustments often occur without conscious effort, guided by the body's sensory system and muscle coordination. Fossil evidence provides additional insight into how long this structure has existed within the human lineage. Skeletal remains from early human relatives show features associated with upright walking and weight-bearing feet. Although scientists continue to study the details of how these structures developed over time, the general pattern suggests that the foot adapted gradually as bipedal movement became more common among our ancestors. These changes likely occurred over long periods, influenced by the environments in which early humans lived and moved. As landscapes shifted through climate changes and migrations, the human body continued to rely on its ability to travel across varied terrain. Throughout most of this long evolutionary period, the foot interacted directly with the ground beneath it. There is little evidence that footwear played a role in shaping the biological structure of the foot during these early stages. Instead, the design of the human foot appears to reflect a world where natural surfaces were encountered directly with each step. The bones and tissues of the foot, therefore, preserve a quiet record of that past. They remind us that the human body developed within environments where the ground itself was a constant presence beneath our feet, long before shoes became part of everyday life. Long before written history, long before cities or roads, human life unfolded across landscapes that were shaped almost entirely by natural forces. The environments early humans inhabited were not fixed or uniform. They shifted with seasons, rainfall, and the slow movements of rivers and vegetation. Across much of eastern and southern Africa, where the earliest members of our species and their ancestors lived, the land often consisted of open grasslands mixed with scattered trees, patches of woodland, and water sources that appeared and disappeared with changing climate patterns. These landscapes were wide and often unpredictable, encouraging movement rather than permanent settlement. Within such environments, survival depended on the ability to travel steadily across the land. Food sources were rarely concentrated in a single place for long periods. Fruits, seeds, and edible plants followed seasonal cycles. Herds of animals moved across large territories. Water sources could shrink during dry seasons and expand again when rains returned. Small groups of humans responded to these changes by moving with the rhythms of the landscape. Walking became the most reliable way to navigate these environments. It allowed people to explore, observe, and gradually learn the geography around them. During these movements, the human body remained in constant contact with the ground beneath it. Without footwear separating the foot from the earth, each step reflected the shape of the terrain being crossed. The soil of a savanna might be firm and dusty during dry months, while rain could soften it into a layer of damp clay. Grass could cushion the ground in some areas, while exposed rock might appear along riverbanks or hillsides. The foot encountered these surfaces directly. This contact was not only physical but also sensory. The body received information through the feet about the stability and texture of the ground, allowing subtle adjustments in posture and balance. In open landscapes where visibility stretched across long distances, early humans often followed natural routes shaped by the environment itself. River valleys provided access to water and vegetation. Gentle slopes allowed easier travel than steep cliffs. Animal paths sometimes formed informal trails through grasslands or forest edges. These pathways were not permanent structures, but they guided movement through familiar territories over generations. Each journey added to the knowledge of the land stored within the memory of a group. The ground beneath the feet was therefore not only a surface to walk upon, but also part of the wider environment that people learned to read and understand. Climate also played an important role in shaping these landscapes. Periods of rainfall encouraged plant growth and supported animal populations. Drier periods changed the availability of resources, prompting human groups to adjust their movements. These shifts did not necessarily happen suddenly. Often they unfolded gradually across months or years. As conditions changed, people adapted their routes and seasonal patterns of travel. Walking remained the primary way these adjustments were carried out. Over many generations, this pattern of movement allowed human populations to spread across large areas of land. Throughout most of this long period, there is little indication that footwear was commonly used in everyday travel. The surfaces early humans crossed were encountered directly by the body. Sand near riverbanks, compact soil across open plains, and the leaf-covered ground of woodland areas all became part of daily experience through the feet. In this way, the landscapes where humans evolved were not distant backdrops to human life. They were environments experienced through constant movement. The foot, touching the ground step after step, formed a quiet connection between the human body and the wider world it was learning to inhabit. As early humans moved through these landscapes, the ground beneath their feet was rarely the same from one place to another. Natural environments contain many different kinds of surfaces, each shaped by weather, geology, and plant life. In open savannas, the soil could become firm under long periods of sunlight, forming a dry surface that supported steady walking. Near water sources, such as rivers or lakes, the ground often softened into layers of damp sediment. In wooded areas, fallen leaves and organic material formed a softer layer above the soil. Rocky slopes introduced another kind of terrain where balance and careful steps became more important. Early human movement unfolded across all of these surfaces, often within the same day. The human foot encountered this diversity directly. Without the protection of manufactured soles, the foot needed to respond to subtle variations in the ground. When the surface was firm, walking could become smooth and efficient. When it was loose or uneven, the body adjusted automatically. Toes spread slightly to improve stability. Muscles in the foot and lower leg responded to changes in slope or texture. These adjustments often happened without conscious thought. They were guided by the body's ability to sense pressure and movement beneath the skin of the feet. In this way, walking barefoot created a constant feedback loop between the body and the landscape. The terrain itself influenced the rhythm of movement. For example, sandy ground requires slightly different steps than solid soil. When sand shifts under the foot, the body compensates by placing weight more carefully and sometimes shortening each step. On harder surfaces such as packed earth or stone, walking may become more direct because the ground remains stable beneath the heel and arch. Over time, repeated exposure to these different surfaces likely helped shape the walking patterns that humans used while traveling across varied environments. Rather than relying on a single type of terrain, early humans adapted to many landscapes as they expanded into new regions. As human populations gradually spread beyond Africa into parts of Eurasia, the variety of landscapes became even greater. Grasslands, deserts, forests, and coastal areas all presented different surfaces underfoot. In colder regions, seasonal changes introduced frozen ground during winter months and softer soil during warmer seasons. These environmental differences influenced how people moved across the land and how frequently they traveled between locations. Despite these changes, the basic relationship between the human foot and the ground remained consistent for much of early history. Movement still occurred directly on natural surfaces rather than on constructed roads or artificial flooring. Archaeological evidence sometimes preserves traces of this relationship in unexpected ways. In certain places where sediments hardened over time, the shapes of ancient footsteps have remained visible long after the people who made them disappeared. These preserved tracks appear in locations where the ground was once soft enough to record the impression of a foot. The outlines show toes spreading slightly, heels pressing downward, and the arch leaving a curved shape between them. Such details suggest direct contact between the foot and the earth rather than the presence of footwear. Although these preserved tracks are rare, they provide glimpses into how early humans interacted with the landscapes they crossed. Each impression represents a moment of contact between the human body and the ground beneath it. When viewed together, they remind us that for most of human history, the terrain itself was not something distant from daily life. It was encountered directly through the simple act of walking. Across countless journeys through forests, grasslands, and river valleys, the human foot remained a constant companion to the land it traveled. As humans continued to explore new territories, the landscapes beneath their feet slowly expanded beyond the regions where our species first appeared. Movement across land allowed small groups to follow rivers, cross open plains, and gradually enter unfamiliar environments. Over many generations, these journeys carried human populations into parts of the world that differed greatly in climate and terrain. Forests grew thicker in some regions, deserts stretched across others, and mountains introduced steep slopes and rocky ground. Despite these differences, the fundamental method of travel remained the same. People moved on foot, step after step, across surfaces shaped by nature rather than by human construction. This long process of migration did not happen all at once. It unfolded slowly across thousands of years as groups adapted to new conditions. Some landscapes encouraged steady travel along natural corridors such as valleys or coastlines. Others required more careful navigation through dense vegetation or uneven ground. In each case, the human body interacted directly with the terrain being crossed. The ground could be warm under strong sunlight or cool during early mornings and evenings. It could be dry and firm in one season, then softened by rain in another. These changing conditions became part of the daily experience of movement. Walking barefoot meant that the surface of the land was not distant from the body. Instead, it was felt continuously through the feet. Across these varied environments, early humans learned to read the landscape in subtle ways. The shape of the land often suggested where travel would be easier or more difficult. Gentle slopes required less effort than steep hills. Areas near water provided both resources and smoother ground for movement. Rocky regions demanded slower and more deliberate steps. Such observations gradually formed a kind of environmental knowledge that was passed through generations. This knowledge did not rely on written maps or formal measurements. It developed through repeated journeys across the same territories over long periods of time. The foot played an important role in this interaction with the land. Because it remained in direct contact with the ground, it provided constant sensory information about the terrain. Slight changes in pressure or texture signaled whether the surface was stable or shifting. The body responded by adjusting balance, step length, or walking rhythm. These adjustments allowed humans to move efficiently across environments that were far from uniform. In this way, the foot functioned not only as a support for the body but also as a quiet guide during travel. Evidence of early human movement across such landscapes appears in archaeological discoveries scattered across different parts of the world. Stone tools, campsites, and other traces indicate that people traveled widely long before permanent settlements became common. In some locations, preserved footprints provide direct evidence of individuals walking across soft ground thousands of years ago. These footprints often show clear impressions of toes and arches pressing into the earth. Although such discoveries are rare, they confirm something that might otherwise be easy to overlook. For much of human history, the human body moved across the world without the separation created by footwear. The ground itself remained part of the everyday environment experienced through the senses. When we consider the vast timescale of these migrations, a pattern begins to emerge. Humans explored continents, adapted to climates, and established new ways of life across diverse landscapes. Throughout most of this long journey, the contact between foot and earth remained unchanged. Walking barefoot was not unusual or remarkable. It was simply how humans moved through the world during the long period before shoes became a regular part of daily life. Sometimes the ground itself keeps quiet records of the past. Most footsteps disappear almost immediately after they are made. Wind moves across loose soil. Rain softens the edges of a footprint. New layers of dust or sand slowly cover what once existed on the surface. For this reason, the simple act of walking usually leaves no permanent trace in the archaeological record. Yet on rare occasions, conditions align in such a way that a single step becomes preserved. Soft ground captures the shape of a foot. Sediment later hardens, turning that brief moment of contact into something that can survive for thousands of years. When researchers discover such preserved footprints, they gain a small but powerful glimpse into how humans once moved across ancient landscapes. These footprints often appear in places where the ground was once moist or soft enough to record the pressure of a step. Riverbanks, lake shores, and coastal areas are among the environments where such traces have been found. In these locations, fine layers of mud or sediment can briefly hold the outline of a foot before being covered by additional deposits. Over long periods of time, these layers harden and become part of the geological record. When erosion later exposes them, the impressions of ancient steps reappear on the surface. To archaeologists and geologists, such discoveries offer valuable evidence about the past. One of the most striking aspects of these preserved footprints is their clarity. In many cases, the shapes of individual toes can still be seen. The curve of the arch appears between the heel and the ball of the foot. Sometimes even the subtle spreading of the toes becomes visible where the foot pressed into soft ground. These details allow researchers to study how the foot interacted with the surface at the moment the step was made. They also provide clues about the size and posture of the person who walked there long ago. By measuring the length and spacing of footprints, scientists can estimate the walking pace of an individual or group. In some cases, multiple sets of tracks appear together, suggesting that several people traveled across the same area within a short period of time. What these footprints consistently reveal is direct contact between the human foot and the earth. The impressions show the natural shape of the foot rather than the outline of footwear. Toes appear clearly separated, and the arch leaves a curved space in the center of the print. This pattern matches the anatomy of a bare human foot pressing into soft sediment. While it is always possible that simple forms of foot coverings existed in some situations, the preserved prints themselves show that bare feet interacted with the ground in many of the environments where these traces formed. Some of the most well-known ancient footprints come from regions where early human populations lived thousands of years ago. In certain sites, researchers have discovered trackways that extend across stretches of hardened ground, revealing the paths people once walked near water sources. These trackways sometimes show individuals moving at different speeds, suggesting ordinary movement rather than ceremonial or unusual activity. In other words, the footprints capture moments from everyday life. A person walked across soft ground, perhaps near a river or lake, and continued on their way. The step remained, quietly preserved beneath layers of sediment. Such discoveries remind us that much of human history unfolded through simple acts repeated countless times. Walking across landscapes, searching for resources, and moving between familiar locations were ordinary parts of life for early humans. When these rare footprints appear in the geological record, they provide direct evidence of that movement. They show that long before shoes became common, human feet pressed directly into the earth as people traveled through the environments where our species slowly spread across the world. When archaeologists encounter ancient footprints preserved in layers of hardened sediment, they approach them with careful attention. A single footprint may appear simple at first glance, but it can contain several kinds of information about the moment it was created. The depth of the heel, the shape of the arch, and the direction of the toes all reveal how the foot pressed against the ground. By examining these details, researchers attempt to understand how a person moved across that surface long ago. These observations do not tell the full story of the individual who made the print, but they offer small pieces of evidence about the physical interaction between the body and the landscape. One important detail often studied is the depth of different parts of the footprint. In many preserved tracks, the heel leaves a deeper impression where it first contacted the ground. The front of the foot may show a slightly different pattern where the body pushed forward into the next step. This sequence reflects the same walking motion seen in people today. Even though thousands of years may separate modern observers from the individuals who created the prints, the fundamental mechanics of walking remain recognizable. The human foot still performs the same sequence of movements that helped early humans travel across natural terrain. Researchers also pay attention to the spacing between footprints. When several steps appear in a line, the distance between them can provide clues about the speed of movement. Closely spaced prints may indicate slow walking, while wider spacing can suggest faster travel. Sometimes multiple sets of footprints appear together, moving in the same direction across the ancient surface. These trackways can suggest that more than one person passed through the area at roughly the same time. In certain sites, the footprints of adults and children appear together, offering hints that small groups traveled across these landscapes rather than isolated individuals. Another aspect that attracts attention is the clarity of the toes within the footprints. When a foot presses directly into soft ground, the toes may spread slightly as they help maintain balance. This spreading sometimes appears clearly in preserved prints. The big toe often points forward in line with the other toes, reflecting the structure of the human foot adapted for upright walking. The arch may leave only a light impression or none at all, depending on how firmly the foot contacted the surface. Together, these features form a pattern that matches the anatomy of a bare human foot rather than the shape of footwear. In most preserved trackways discovered so far, the impressions reveal toes and other anatomical features that would likely be obscured by thick coverings. Because of this, many researchers interpret these footprints as evidence of barefoot movement across natural ground. At the same time, scientists remain cautious about drawing conclusions beyond what the evidence clearly shows. The absence of footwear impressions in these particular tracks does not necessarily mean that early humans never used simple forms of foot protection in other situations. Materials such as plant fibers, leather, or animal skins would decay quickly and rarely leave clear archaeological traces. As a result, the archaeological record of footwear is limited. Even so, the footprints themselves provide direct evidence that many individuals walked barefoot across the landscapes where these traces formed. Each preserved step represents a brief moment when the human body pressed into soft ground and then moved on. Over long periods of time, such moments accumulated into patterns of travel that connected people with the environments they inhabited. Through these rare prints, the ground itself becomes a quiet archive of human movement, preserving the shape of bare feet that once crossed the earth thousands of years ago. In a few rare places around the world, The ground has preserved entire sequences of ancient footsteps rather than a single, isolated print. These sequences are sometimes called trackways. They appear as lines of footprints moving across a surface that was once soft enough to record each step before hardening over time. When researchers discover such trackways, they gain a broader view of how people once moved through their surroundings. Instead of observing a single moment, they can follow the rhythm of many steps as a person or group crossed a particular area. These preserved paths are often found in environments that were once near water. Lakeshores, riverbanks, and wetlands create conditions where fine sediment can capture the shape of a foot before additional layers settle on top of it. Over thousands of years, these layers compress and harden, turning temporary impressions into lasting features of the landscape. When erosion later exposes these surfaces, the ancient steps appear once again, sometimes forming long patterns that stretch across the ground. In several well-studied sites, researchers have documented trackways where dozens of footprints move in the same direction. The spacing between the prints often reflects the natural stride of walking humans. The heel of each step presses first into the sediment, followed by the ball of the foot and the toes. This pattern repeats again and again across the surface, forming a visible sequence of movement frozen in time. When multiple individuals cross the same area, their trackways may overlap or run parallel to one another. In certain cases, smaller prints appear beside larger ones, suggesting that children and adults walk through the same landscape together. Such details do not reveal the thoughts or intentions of the individuals who made the tracks, but they offer small glimpses into the social presence of people within these environments. The shape of the footprints within these trackways often displays clear anatomical features of the human foot. Toes appear distinct at the front of the print, sometimes slightly spread as the foot pushed forward during the step. The arch leaves a curved gap where less pressure touched the ground. The heel forms the deepest part of the impression. These elements combine to form the recognizable outline of a bare human foot interacting directly with soft earth. If thick footwear had been present, the impressions would likely appear more uniform or display edges associated with the shape of the covering. Instead, many preserved trackways reveal the natural contours of the foot itself. Scientists studying these prints usually interpret them cautiously. A single site cannot represent the behavior of all early human populations across every region, yet when footprints from different places and time periods display similar patterns, they strengthen the idea that direct contact between foot and ground was a common part of daily movement. Across many of these sites, the impressions reflect walking that appears calm and ordinary, rather than hurried or unusual. The steps follow steady paths across the ancient surfaces, suggesting routine travel through landscapes that people knew well. These quiet traces remind us that much of human history unfolded through simple actions repeated countless times. Walking toward water, returning to shelter, or moving between familiar places were activities that left only temporary marks on the land. On rare occasions, however, the ground captured those marks long enough for them to reach the present. When we look at these ancient trackways today, we are seeing brief moments of human movement preserved across great stretches of time. They show that long before roads, sidewalks, and modern footwear, the human journey across the earth was written step by bare feet pressing into the soil beneath them. For most of human history, the human foot appears to have remained in direct contact with the ground. Yet at some point, people in certain environments began to experiment with ways of protecting their feet. This shift did not happen everywhere at the same time, and it likely did not begin as a permanent habit. Instead, the earliest forms of foot covering probably appeared as practical responses to specific conditions in the environment. In colder regions, the ground could become extremely cold during certain seasons. In rocky landscapes, sharp stones might increase the risk of injury during long journeys. Under such circumstances, simple materials from the surrounding environment could be used to create temporary protection for the feet. These early coverings were likely made from natural materials that were available to human communities. Animal skins, plant fibers, and pieces of leather could be wrapped around the foot to form a basic layer between skin and ground. Unlike modern shoes, these coverings would have been simple and flexible. They may have resembled wrappings or soft pouches rather than structured footwear. Because the materials used in their construction were organic, they rarely survived long enough to become part of the archaeological record. Over time, leather decays. Plant fibers break down and disappear. As a result, Physical evidence of the earliest footwear is extremely limited. Despite this scarcity of preserved objects, researchers have discovered a few ancient examples that provide clues about when footwear began to appear. Some of the oldest surviving shoes come from archaeological sites where dry conditions help preserve fragile materials. In one well-known example discovered in a cave in Armenia, a leather shoe estimated to be several thousand years old was found remarkably intact. Its design was simple, shaped from a single piece of leather and fitted around the foot with laces. Although this example belongs to a much later period than the earliest stages of human history, it offers a glimpse into how basic footwear may have been constructed. Other discoveries from different regions include fragments of woven plant fibers that may have formed sandals. These remains suggest that early footwear was often lightweight and adapted to local materials rather than produced through complex manufacturing. Even with these discoveries, the timeline of early footwear remains uncertain. Archaeologists rarely find clear evidence from periods far back in human prehistory. Organic materials that might once have formed shoes simply do not preserve well under most environmental conditions. Because of this, scientists rely on indirect clues when studying the possible origins of footwear. For example, some researchers examine changes in the structure of foot bones found in ancient skeletal remains. If footwear had been used regularly over long periods, certain patterns of bone wear might appear. However, the interpretation of such evidence remains cautious because many factors can influence bone structure. The available evidence therefore suggests that footwear appeared relatively late compared with the long evolutionary history of the human foot. For hundreds of thousands of years before these inventions, humans moved across landscapes without permanent foot coverings. When simple footwear did begin to appear in some regions, it likely served practical purposes linked to climate or terrain, rather than replacing barefoot movement everywhere. In many warmer environments, walking barefoot may have remained the most common way of moving across the land. The introduction of early footwear did not immediately transform human life. Instead, it marked the beginning of a gradual shift in how humans interacted with the ground beneath them, a shift that would unfold slowly across many generations. Even though physical examples of early footwear are rare, scientists have found other ways to explore when humans may have begun covering their feet. One approach involves studying the bones of the foot itself. Over long periods of time, the structure of bones can reflect patterns of use and pressure within the body. If a population regularly used thick footwear that limited the movement of the toes, certain parts of the foot might experience different stresses than they would during barefoot walking. Some researchers have suggested that subtle changes in toe bones in later prehistoric skeletons could indicate the gradual adoption of footwear in particular regions. However, such interpretations remain careful and cautious, because many factors can influence how bones develop over a lifetime. Diet, physical activity, terrain, and overall health can all affect skeletal structure. For this reason, bone evidence alone cannot provide a precise timeline for when shoes first appeared. Another line of investigation comes from the environments in which early humans lived. In warm climates where the ground rarely becomes dangerously cold, walking barefoot can be practical for much of the year. Many tropical and subtropical landscapes offer soil, sand, or vegetation that can be crossed without serious injury. In such environments, simple foot coverings might not have been necessary for everyday movement. By contrast, colder regions present different challenges. Frozen ground, snow, and sharp ice can quickly damage exposed skin. When human populations gradually moved into colder climates during ancient migrations, new forms of protection may have become more useful. Wrapping the feet in animal skins or plant materials could help reduce exposure to cold surfaces. These coverings might have been worn during certain seasons or during travel across particularly harsh terrain. Because such materials would eventually decay, the archaeological record preserves only very limited traces of them. Cultural practices also likely influenced whether footwear was used regularly. Different communities developed their own ways of adapting to local conditions. In some regions, simple sandals made from woven plant fibers may have been practical in warm climates where the ground became hot under the sun. In other places, thicker coverings made from animal hides could provide insulation during cold seasons. These solutions would have depended on available materials, environmental conditions, and the daily activities of the people using them. The important point is that footwear did not appear everywhere at once as a universal change in human behavior. Instead, it likely emerged in different forms in different regions as people experimented with ways to protect their feet under certain circumstances. Even when early forms of footwear existed, they may not have been worn continuously. A person might travel barefoot across familiar terrain but use protective coverings when conditions required it. In this way, barefoot walking likely remained a common experience for much of human history, even after the first experiments with footwear began. The introduction of simple foot coverings therefore represents a gradual adaptation rather than a sudden transformation. It reflects the creativity of human communities responding to environmental challenges while still maintaining the long tradition of moving across landscapes with direct contact between the body and the earth. When viewed across the deep timeline of human existence, the appearance of early footwear occupies only a small chapter within a much longer story, in which the human foot evolved and functioned in direct relationship with the ground beneath it. As time passed and human societies became more diverse, the ways people protected their feet also began to vary from place to place. Different environments encouraged different solutions. In warm regions where the ground remained relatively gentle, many communities continued to move across the land with little or no footwear. The soil, sand, or grass beneath their feet rarely required thick protection. In these settings, the human foot could remain in direct contact with the ground for most daily activities. Walking barefoot was not unusual or symbolic. It was simply part of ordinary life. In other regions, however, conditions encouraged the development of simple protective coverings. Where rocky terrain made walking uncomfortable, thin layers of material could reduce friction between the skin and the ground. Where temperatures dropped during colder seasons, wrapping the feet could help preserve warmth. These early forms of protection were usually simple and practical. They were made from materials that were available within the surrounding landscape. Animal hides could be shaped loosely around the foot. Fibers from plants might be woven into flat sandals. In some cultures, strips of leather or cloth could be tied around the foot and ankle to hold these coverings in place. None of these designs resembled the rigid footwear produced by modern manufacturing. Instead, they were flexible and often temporary, created through everyday craftsmanship rather than specialized industry. Because these materials were organic, they rarely survived long enough to appear in archaeological excavations. Over centuries, leather decays and plant fibers break down into the soil. This means that the earliest stages of footwear use are difficult to trace through physical remains. What archaeologists often find instead are later examples from periods when preservation conditions were unusually favorable. In dry caves or extremely arid regions, pieces of ancient sandals or leather footwear sometimes remain intact. These discoveries show that early shoes were often lightweight and closely shaped to the foot rather than heavily structured. They provided protection while still allowing the foot to move naturally. Even after such coverings appeared, barefoot walking did not disappear. In many communities, footwear was used only in specific situations rather than throughout the entire day. People might wear protective coverings when traveling across rough terrain, but remove them when resting or working on softer ground. In warmer climates, sandals might be worn during certain tasks but not considered necessary for every movement. The relationship between foot and ground, therefore, remained flexible. Footwear became one tool among many rather than an absolute requirement for daily life. Cultural traditions also influenced how footwear was viewed. In some societies, shoes became associated with status or special occasions. In others, they remained simple, practical items with little symbolic meaning. The diversity of these practices reflects the wide range of environments and lifestyles that developed as human populations spread across different regions of the world. Yet beneath these differences, one constant remained visible in the deeper timeline of human history. The human foot itself had already evolved long before most forms of footwear existed. Its structure had developed under conditions where natural ground was encountered directly during daily movement. For this reason, the appearance of footwear did not replace an earlier biological design. Instead, it introduced a new layer between the body and the landscape. Over time, this layer would gradually become more common in many parts of the world. But during the long early chapters of human history, walking barefoot remained the most familiar way that people moved through the environments where they lived. As human populations gradually spread across wider regions of the world, the climates they encountered became increasingly varied. Some landscapes remained warm throughout the year, while others introduced colder seasons and harsher conditions. These environmental differences shaped many aspects of daily life, including how people moved across the ground beneath them. In warm climates, the earth itself often remained suitable for barefoot travel. Soil, sand, and grass rarely reached temperatures that threatened the skin, and the absence of snow or ice meant that the foot could remain exposed without serious risk. For communities living in such regions, walking barefoot could continue as a practical and familiar way of moving through the landscape. The ground was encountered directly, much as it had been for earlier generations of humans. In colder climates, however, the relationship between foot and ground could become more complicated. During winter months in northern regions, the surface of the earth could freeze for long periods of time. Snow covered the ground, and ice formed along rivers and open areas. Under these conditions, direct contact between bare skin and the frozen surface could quickly become painful or dangerous. Exposure to extreme cold can damage tissues if it continues for too long. For people living in such environments, protecting the feet became increasingly important during certain seasons. One possible response to these conditions involved wrapping the feet in insulating materials. Animal skins provided one potential solution because they could trap warm air near the body. When tied or folded around the foot, a hide could create a barrier between skin and frozen ground. Fur might also provide additional insulation. These coverings would have been relatively simple, shaped by hand and secured with strips of leather or plant fibers. They may not have resembled the structured shoes familiar today, but they could still reduce the direct exposure of the foot to cold surfaces. Such coverings would likely have been used during travel across snow or frozen terrain rather than worn continuously throughout the year. In regions where seasonal changes were strong, footwear may have become a temporary adaptation to winter conditions. During warmer months, people might return to barefoot movement across soil, grass, or forest floors. This seasonal rhythm would reflect the flexibility of human communities in responding to changing environments. Rather than relying on a single fixed solution, people adjusted their habits depending on the climate around them. Rocky landscapes also presented challenges that could influence the use of foot coverings. In mountainous regions or areas with sharp stones, repeated contact with rough surfaces could increase the risk of cuts or injuries. Simple protective layers might help reduce this risk during long journeys. Even so, the presence of such terrain did not necessarily eliminate barefoot walking. People familiar with their environment could learn to move carefully across rocky ground, adjusting their steps to avoid sharp edges and unstable surfaces. Evidence from many traditional societies suggests that barefoot travel remained possible even in landscapes that appear challenging to modern observers accustomed to constant footwear. The development of early protective coverings for the feet therefore reflects the adaptability of human communities as they entered new climates and terrains. Instead of appearing suddenly as a universal invention, footwear likely emerged gradually in response to specific environmental pressures. In warmer regions, the human foot could continue its long relationship with the natural ground largely unchanged. In colder or rougher landscapes, simple coverings might be used when conditions required additional protection. Across these different environments, the basic structure of the human foot remained the same, carrying forward the biological design that had formed during a much earlier period, when walking barefoot across the earth was the ordinary condition of human life. Climate did more than influence temperature beneath the feet. It also shaped the wider environments through which human communities moved each day. Rainfall, wind, and seasonal change slowly altered the surfaces of the land. During wetter periods, the ground in many regions could become soft and muddy, especially near rivers and low valleys. During dry seasons, that same ground might harden into firm soil or crack under long exposure to sunlight. These shifts created a constantly changing landscape underfoot, one that early humans experienced directly through the soles of their feet. Walking barefoot meant that the body adapted naturally to these changes. When soil softened after rainfall, steps often became slower and more careful to avoid slipping. When the ground hardened under dry conditions, walking could become smoother and more efficient. Such adjustments were small but continuous, allowing people to move safely across environments that were never entirely predictable. The human foot, with its combination of strength and flexibility, played an important role in managing these variations in terrain. Over time, the body developed patterns of movement suited to the surfaces that people encountered most frequently. In many environments, the natural ground was not consistently dangerous or harmful. Grasslands, forest floors, and compact soil often provided relatively stable surfaces for travel. Even when small stones or rough textures appeared, the skin of the foot could gradually adapt through repeated contact. The outer layer of skin on the sole tends to thicken slightly when exposed regularly to pressure and friction. This natural response can provide additional protection without the need for manufactured materials. Such adaptation likely helped many early human communities continue walking barefoot in environments where the ground did not pose severe risks. At the same time, some landscapes introduced conditions where extra protection became useful. In deserts, the surface of the sand could become extremely hot under strong sunlight. During the middle of the day, walking across exposed ground might be uncomfortable without some form of covering. In mountainous areas, sharp rocks or loose gravel could create unstable footing during long journeys. These challenges did not necessarily require complex footwear, but they could encourage the occasional use of simple protective layers around the foot. Materials from the surrounding environment offered practical solutions. Plant fibers could be woven into flat coverings that shielded the sole from hot surfaces. Animal skins could cushion the foot when walking across rough terrain. These materials were flexible and lightweight, allowing the foot to maintain much of its natural movement. In many cases, such coverings may have been worn only during specific activities, such as traveling long distances or crossing particularly harsh terrain. Once conditions improved, people might return to barefoot movement that allowed greater sensory contact with the ground. Seasonal rhythms also influenced these choices. In some regions, environmental conditions changed dramatically over the course of a year. Heavy rains could soften the ground for months, while dry seasons created firm surfaces better suited for travel. In colder areas, snow and ice might appear during winter but disappear completely during warmer months. Human communities responded to these shifts with flexible habits, adjusting clothing and equipment as needed. Foot protection was likely part of this broader pattern of adaptation rather than a constant feature of daily life. Seen from this perspective, the development of early footwear reflects the interaction between human ingenuity and environmental challenge. People observed the landscapes around them and used available materials to solve practical problems when they arose. Yet even as these solutions appeared, the long tradition of barefoot walking continued across many regions of the world. The human foot remained capable of traveling across diverse terrains, carrying forward the evolutionary design that had formed during countless generations of direct contact with the earth. Over long stretches of time, human communities learned to adapt their daily habits to the environments in which they lived. Climate, terrain, and available resources all influenced how people moved across the land. In some regions, natural conditions allowed barefoot walking to remain comfortable for much of the year. In others, temporary solutions were developed to protect the feet during certain seasons or journeys. These responses were not part of a single global change. Instead, they reflected many local adaptations shaped by the landscapes where people lived. In warm tropical regions, the ground was often covered by soil, vegetation, or sand that did not pose constant danger to bare skin. Rainfall and plant growth softened the landscape in many places, and temperatures rarely dropped low enough to freeze the ground. In such environments, walking barefoot could remain the most practical option for daily life. Even today, in some parts of the world with similar climates, people sometimes move comfortably without shoes during routine activities. This observation does not mean that ancient populations lived exactly the same way, but it shows that certain environments make barefoot movement more feasible than others. By contrast, regions with colder climates introduced conditions that required more protection during particular times of the year. Snow and ice could make direct contact with the ground difficult during winter months. Animal skins or simple wrappings could provide insulation when people needed to travel across frozen terrain. These coverings might have been removed once conditions changed and the ground became easier to cross again. In this way, footwear may have appeared as a seasonal response rather than a permanent part of daily life. People adapted their behavior according to the changing environment, adjusting their clothing and equipment when necessary. Terrain also played an important role in shaping these choices. In areas with dense forests, the ground might be covered with layers of leaves and organic material that softened each step. Such surfaces could allow barefoot walking even during long periods of travel. In open plains, compact soil often created stable ground beneath the feet. Mountainous regions, however, sometimes introduced sharp stones or loose gravel that required careful movement. In these landscapes, temporary foot protection could reduce the risk of injury during long journeys. Yet even in such conditions, barefoot movement did not disappear completely. People familiar with their environment often learned how to step carefully across uneven terrain. These patterns suggest that the appearance of early footwear did not replace barefoot walking in a simple or immediate way. Instead, both practices likely existed side by side for long periods. A person might travel barefoot through familiar territory but use protective coverings during difficult journeys or harsh weather. Over generations, different cultures developed their own traditions regarding when and how footwear should be used. Some communities may have relied on simple sandals made from plant fibers, while others used animal hides to wrap the feet during cold seasons. What remained constant throughout this diversity was the biological design of the human foot itself. That structure had evolved during a much earlier time when humans moved directly across natural ground without manufactured barriers. The bones, ligaments, and sensory systems of the foot continued to function in ways shaped by that long evolutionary past. Even as people began to experiment with protective coverings in certain environments, the fundamental relationship between the human body and the earth beneath it remained deeply rooted in the long history of barefoot movement across the landscapes where our species first learned to walk. For much of recorded history, even after the earliest forms of footwear appeared, walking barefoot continued to be a common part of daily life in many societies. The presence of simple shoes or sandals did not immediately replace older habits. Instead, the use of footwear varied depending on climate, occupation, and cultural customs. In many warm regions, people continued to move across the ground with bare feet during ordinary activities, reserving footwear only for specific occasions or environments. This pattern can be observed in historical descriptions, artwork, and archaeological remains from different parts of the world. In agricultural communities, for example, much of daily work took place directly on the land. Farmers and labourers spent long hours in fields, gardens, and riverbanks where the ground consisted of soil, mud, or vegetation. In such settings, footwear could easily become heavy or uncomfortable, especially if it absorbed water or mud during work. Moving barefoot allowed the feet to adapt naturally to the texture of the ground while maintaining balance on uneven surfaces. The ability of the toes to spread and grip slightly could help people remain stable while planting crops, harvesting plants, or walking across soft soil. Because of this, going barefoot was often practical rather than unusual in many rural environments. Historical accounts from different regions also suggest that footwear was sometimes associated with social or economic differences. In certain societies, shoes were valuable objects that required time and resources to produce. Leather needed to be prepared and shaped, while woven materials required careful craftsmanship. As a result, footwear could become a symbol of wealth or status in some communities. People who owned finely made shoes might wear them during travel, ceremonies, or visits to important places. At the same time, many others continued their daily activities barefoot simply because it was normal within their social environment. This contrast shows that the use of footwear was influenced not only by physical conditions but also by cultural values and available resources. In warm climates, the ground itself often allowed barefoot walking without severe discomfort. Paths through villages or fields might consist of compact soil worn smooth by repeated travel. Riverbanks and forest floors could provide soft surfaces beneath the feet. Even in areas with stones or rough textures, familiarity with the terrain allowed people to move carefully and confidently across the landscape. Over time, the skin on the soles of the feet could adapt to these conditions, becoming thicker in response to regular contact with the ground. Such natural adaptation allowed many individuals to walk comfortably across surfaces that might seem difficult to modern observers who are accustomed to constant footwear. Cultural traditions sometimes reflected these everyday practices. In certain historical artworks and written descriptions, people are depicted barefoot during routine tasks while wearing footwear only in particular contexts. Travelers might carry sandals for long journeys but remove them while resting or working. In other situations, shoes might be worn when entering formal spaces or during ceremonial events. These patterns reveal that the relationship between the human foot and footwear remained flexible across different societies. Rather than becoming an immediate universal habit, the use of shoes developed gradually within particular cultural settings. When viewed across long periods of time, These historical examples suggest that barefoot movement remained widespread even after footwear had been invented. For many communities, direct contact between foot and ground continued to shape daily experience. The presence of sandals, leather shoes, or other coverings added new possibilities, but it did not erase the older connection between the human body and the natural surfaces of the earth. In many historical societies, footwear was not simply a matter of protection from the ground. It also carried meanings that were shaped by social customs and cultural traditions. While the human foot had evolved through long periods of direct contact with natural surfaces, the appearance of shoes gradually introduced new symbolic roles for what people wore on their feet. These meanings varied widely between communities, but they often reflected differences in social position, occupation, or the setting in which a person was moving. In some cultures, shoes became associated with formal occasions or public appearances. Individuals might wear sandals or leather footwear when traveling to markets, attending gatherings, or visiting places of authority. In contrast, daily work performed within familiar surroundings could still take place barefoot. Farmers, fishermen, and laborers frequently worked directly on the soil, along riverbanks, or within fields where the ground itself was part of the working environment. In these contexts, footwear could become impractical or unnecessary. Removing shoes allowed the feet to move more freely and adapt to the texture of the surface beneath them. Historical records from various regions describe similar patterns in which footwear appeared mainly during certain activities rather than as a constant requirement. The availability of materials also influenced how commonly shoes were used. Producing leather footwear required access to animal hides as well as the time and skill needed to prepare and shape them. In communities where resources were limited, such items might not be produced in large quantities. Sandals woven from plant fibers were sometimes easier to make, but they still required effort and craftsmanship. As a result, footwear could remain relatively valuable in some societies. People might own only one pair of sandals or shoes, reserving them for travel or special situations. During everyday tasks close to home, walking barefoot remained normal because it required no additional materials. Cultural practices surrounding cleanliness and indoor spaces also influenced when footwear was worn. In several historical traditions, shoes were removed before entering homes or certain buildings. This practice reflected a desire to keep indoor spaces free from dirt carried from outside. When people spent time within such spaces, their feet came into direct contact with the floor rather than remaining inside footwear. Although these customs varied from place to place, they illustrate how the boundary between barefoot and shod movement remained fluid in many cultures. Even as shoes became more familiar, they were not always worn continuously. Climate continued to play a role in shaping these habits. In warm regions, the ground often remained comfortable enough for barefoot walking during daily routines. Paths worn smooth by repeated use could be crossed without serious discomfort. The body adapted gradually to these surfaces through regular contact. Over time, the soles of the feet developed a natural resilience that allowed people to move across familiar terrain with confidence. This adaptation did not eliminate the usefulness of footwear in more difficult conditions, but it allowed barefoot movement to remain practical in environments where the ground posed few hazards. Across different societies and historical periods, these patterns reveal that the adoption of footwear unfolded slowly and unevenly. Shoes became part of human culture in many regions, yet they did not immediately replace older habits of moving across the land barefoot. Instead, both practices coexisted. People moved between them depending on their surroundings, their work, and the customs of their community. The human foot, shaped by a much older evolutionary history, continued to interact with the ground directly, even as new cultural meanings began to form around the use of footwear. Across many parts of the world, historical descriptions and visual records suggest that the boundary between barefoot and shod life remained flexible for long periods of time. Even in societies where footwear had become familiar, people often moved between wearing shoes and walking barefoot depending on the situation. This pattern reflects the practical nature of many traditional lifestyles, where daily routines were closely connected to the natural environment. Instead of treating footwear as a permanent requirement, people adjusted their habits according to the tasks they performed and the surfaces they encountered. In villages and rural settlements, the ground itself often formed the primary surface of daily life. Paths between homes were commonly made of packed soil shaped by repeated footsteps. Courtyards and open working spaces might be covered with earth, sand, or stone. In such settings, walking barefoot could feel natural and comfortable, especially for individuals who had grown up moving across these surfaces from an early age. The feet gradually adapted to the textures of familiar terrain. The outer layers of skin became more resilient through repeated contact, allowing people to move confidently across the ground without constant protection. Historical artwork from different cultures sometimes depicts people barefoot during ordinary activities such as farming, gathering water, or working in domestic spaces. Footwear appears in these images primarily in contexts that involve travel, ceremony, or social distinction. This visual contrast reflects a broader pattern in which shoes served specific purposes rather than becoming an inseparable part of everyday movement. Sandals might be worn during journeys across long distances, while bare feet remained common within the boundaries of home or community life. In many cases, removing footwear also made practical sense when working in fields, gardens, or near water. Soil and mud could quickly accumulate on shoes, making them heavier or more difficult to clean. Bare feet, by contrast, could be washed easily after work. In warmer climates, this flexibility allowed people to move between different surfaces throughout the day without relying constantly on footwear. Cultural customs also influenced how people used shoes within shared spaces. In some traditions, entering homes or sacred places required removing footwear as a sign of respect or cleanliness. This practice meant that even individuals who owned shoes would spend part of their day walking barefoot indoors. Over time, such customs reinforced the idea that footwear was not necessary in every setting. The act of removing shoes became a routine transition between the outside world and interior spaces. These patterns illustrate how the spread of footwear unfolded gradually rather than as a sudden transformation of human life. Shoes became more common in many societies, but they did not immediately erase the older relationship between the human foot and the ground. Instead, they joined a range of cultural habits that shaped when and where people covered their feet. Across generations, this balance allowed barefoot movement to remain part of everyday experience in many communities. When viewed against the deep timeline of human history, these traditions represent a continuation of something far older. The human body had spent hundreds of thousands of years moving directly across natural ground before footwear became widely available. Even as shoes appeared in different cultures, the practice of walking barefoot remained quietly present within daily life, reminding us that the connection between the human foot and the earth had never fully disappeared. Over time, as human societies changed and settlements grew larger, the environments people moved through also began to transform. For most of earlier history, walking meant crossing natural ground, shaped by weather, plants, and geological processes. Soil, grass, sand, and stone formed the surfaces beneath human feet. However, as villages developed into towns and towns slowly expanded into cities, new kinds of ground began to appear. Paths were gradually reinforced with packed earth, wooden planks, or later with stone. These changes did not happen suddenly, but over many generations they introduced a subtle shift in the relationship between the human body and the surface of the land. In early settlements, most surfaces were still natural. Streets might consist of compacted soil formed by repeated travel. Rain could soften these surfaces, while dry weather hardened them again. As populations increased and trade routes expanded, communities began to build more durable pathways. Stone paving appeared in certain places where frequent movement required more stable ground. These paved areas were often found near markets, temples, or centers of political activity. The new surfaces were more consistent than natural terrain, but they also created different conditions beneath the feet. Hard stone returned impact directly through each step in a way that softer soil did not. As these constructed surfaces became more common, footwear gradually gained new importance in some environments. Walking across stone streets or rough paving could feel different from walking across soil or grass. Thin sandals or leather shoes helped reduce friction and pressure during long walks through urban spaces. In this way, the growth of settlements slowly encouraged more regular use of footwear in certain settings. The change did not affect all people equally. Those who spent much of their time working within fields, forests, or riverbanks still moved across natural surfaces where barefoot walking remained familiar. Yet within growing towns and trade centers, the ground itself had begun to change. Another shift accompanied these developments. As human environments became more constructed, the sensory relationship between foot and ground also began to transform. Natural terrain offers a wide range of textures and small variations in surface. Grass bends beneath the foot, soil compresses slightly under pressure, sand shifts with each step. These subtle differences provide continuous sensory feedback that the body uses to adjust balance and movement. Constructed surfaces, by contrast, often remain more uniform. Stone streets, wooden floors, and later paved roads reduce the variety of textures encountered beneath the feet. Footwear further increases this separation by adding a layer between skin and ground. Over time, these changes gradually altered the everyday experience of walking in many human environments. Cultural factors also contributed to this shift. As societies developed more complex systems of trade and governance, footwear began to appear more frequently in public spaces. Shoes could reflect occupation, social position, or regional traditions. In some places, particular styles of footwear became associated with certain professions or ranks within society. While these customs varied widely between cultures, they all contributed to a slow increase in the visibility of shoes within daily life. Yet even during these transitions, the deeper biological history of the human foot remained unchanged. The structure of the foot had formed during a much earlier period when natural ground shaped human movement. As constructed environments expanded, footwear introduced a growing distance between the body and the surfaces people walked upon. This shift unfolded gradually across centuries, marking the beginning of a new stage in the long story of how humans interacted with the ground beneath their feet. As human settlements grew more complex, the surfaces people walked upon continued to change. Markets, temples, and gathering places gradually became centers of daily activity. Around these spaces, communities often constructed pathways designed to handle constant movement. Stones were arranged to form more stable streets, and wooden platforms sometimes appeared in areas where the ground remained damp or uneven. These surfaces offered practical advantages. They reduced mud during rainy seasons and allowed carts, animals, and travelers to move more easily through crowded settlements. Yet these improvements also introduced a subtle difference in how the human body interacted with the ground. Natural terrain tends to absorb some of the pressure created by walking. Soil compresses slightly under weight, and grass bends with each step. Hard surfaces such as stone or wood behave differently. They return much of the force of each step directly back through the foot and leg. Over long distances, this repeated impact can feel different from walking across softer ground. For individuals who spent much of their time moving through early towns or trade centers, footwear gradually became more useful in managing this change. Sandals and leather shoes could soften the contact between the foot and these harder surfaces, creating a small layer that reduced friction and pressure during long walks. As trade routes expanded, people began traveling greater distances between settlements. Merchants, messengers, and travelers often followed paths that linked villages, towns, and distant regions. These routes sometimes crossed rocky terrain, dry plains, or rough tracks shaped by repeated passage. Under such conditions, footwear could provide protection during extended journeys. Sandals made from woven plant fibers allowed air to circulate in warm climates while still shielding the sole of the foot from rough ground. Leather shoes offered more coverage and durability in areas where the terrain demanded stronger protection. Even so, these early forms of footwear remained relatively simple compared with modern designs. They often allowed the foot to move naturally while adding only a thin barrier between skin and surface. Within settlements, social habits also began to influence how footwear was used. In some communities, wearing shoes in public spaces became more common as towns developed more structured environments. People visiting marketplaces or administrative centers might choose to wear sandals or shoes as part of their public appearance. At the same time, customs within homes or religious spaces sometimes encouraged the removal of footwear before entering. These practices meant that individuals moved regularly between shod and barefoot states depending on where they were. The relationship between foot and ground therefore continued to shift according to the social and physical environment surrounding a person. Over time, these gradual changes introduced a new pattern in the history of human movement. In earlier periods, the ground beneath the feet had almost always been natural terrain. Now, constructed environments were beginning to alter that experience. Paths became smoother, streets harder, and floors more structured. Footwear developed alongside these changes, providing a practical response to the new surfaces appearing within human settlements. This process unfolded slowly across centuries, influenced by trade, architecture, and cultural habits rather than a single invention. Despite these developments, it is important to remember how recent this transformation is when measured against the deeper history of our species. For hundreds of thousands of years before towns and roads appeared, the human foot moved across natural landscapes without permanent barriers between skin and soil. The spread of constructed environments introduced a new stage in this relationship, one in which the ground beneath human feet was gradually reshaped by human hands. As towns expanded and societies developed more organized systems of infrastructure, the surfaces that people walked upon continued to evolve. Streets became more carefully constructed, sometimes lined with stone or reinforced with layers of packed material designed to withstand constant movement. Public spaces such as marketplaces, courtyards, and administrative centers grew busier as trade and communication connected distant regions. These changes gradually altered the daily experience of walking. Instead of moving primarily across soil, grass, or forest floors, many people began spending more time on surfaces shaped intentionally by human design. The difference between these surfaces and natural terrain was subtle but important. Natural ground tends to contain small variations that change with weather and vegetation. Soil can soften under rain, while grass cushions the pressure of a step. Even rocky ground contains irregular textures that encourage careful movement. Constructed surfaces, however, often reduce these variations. A paved street creates a more uniform path where each step meets a similar level of hardness. Wooden floors inside buildings provide another type of consistent surface beneath the feet. As these environments became more common, footwear slowly gained new practical value. Shoes and sandals could reduce the repeated impact that occurs when walking across firm, unyielding surfaces. They also protected the foot from small fragments of stone or debris that might accumulate in busy streets. This shift did not occur everywhere at the same pace. In rural areas where daily life remained closely connected to fields, forests, and rivers, barefoot movement often continued to be practical. Farmers, fishers, and laborers still spent much of their time on natural ground, where the body could interact directly with the terrain. Within growing urban centers, however, the environment was gradually changing. More surfaces were shaped by construction rather than by natural processes, and these surfaces influenced how people chose to protect their feet. Over time, footwear began to appear more regularly within urban life. Markets, trade routes, and administrative centers created spaces where large numbers of people gathered and moved throughout the day. Shoes could provide protection and durability for those who traveled frequently across these constructed environments. At the same time, footwear began to reflect cultural identity in certain communities. Styles of sandals or shoes sometimes differed between regions, occupations, or social groups. While these cultural variations were diverse, they shared a common background: the slow transformation of human environments from natural landscapes into spaces increasingly shaped by human activity. Yet even as this transformation unfolded, the biological structure of the human foot remained the result of a much older evolutionary history. The bones, ligaments, and sensory systems of the foot had developed during long periods when humans moved barefoot across varied terrain. The introduction of shoes and paved surfaces did not change that underlying design. Instead, it added new layers between the body and the ground. In many parts of the world, this separation gradually increased as cities expanded and constructed environments became more widespread. When we consider this process across the long timeline of human history, it reveals how recently this change has occurred. For the vast majority of our species' existence, human movement took place directly upon the natural earth. The growth of towns, roads, and structured spaces introduced a different kind of ground beneath our feet. With it came the gradual rise of footwear as a regular companion to walking, marking a quiet shift in the ancient relationship between the human body and the landscape it once touched directly with every step. As cities continued to grow across different parts of the world, the experience of moving through human environments began to change more noticeably. In earlier periods, even large settlements still contained many natural surfaces. Streets might have been made of packed earth, and open spaces often remained connected to surrounding landscapes. Over time, however, urban areas introduced more durable materials designed to support dense populations and frequent movement. Stone paving, bricks, and later other forms of hardened surfaces gradually became more common in places where people gathered, traded, and travelled. These changes did not simply affect architecture. They also influenced the way human bodies interacted with the ground beneath them. In natural landscapes, the foot often encounters a wide range of textures. Soil compresses slightly under pressure. Grass cushions each step. Sand shifts and adjusts beneath the toes. These subtle variations allow the body to adapt continuously while walking. In contrast, urban surfaces tend to be more uniform. A paved street or stone courtyard provides little variation from one step to the next. The ground becomes more predictable, but also more rigid. This shift gradually altered how people experience movement through their daily environments. As these constructed surfaces spread through growing cities, footwear began to serve additional purposes beyond occasional protection. Shoes helped reduce the friction between the foot and rough paving stones. They also created a buffer against debris that could accumulate in busy streets, such as small fragments of stone or broken materials. In crowded urban settings where many people and animals moved together, footwear could provide a layer of cleanliness by separating the foot from dirt and waste on the ground. These practical benefits made shoes increasingly useful for those who spent much of their time traveling through city spaces. The rise of organized road systems also played a role in this gradual transformation. Trade networks connecting distant regions encouraged the construction of routes designed to support regular travel. Some of these routes were reinforced with layers of stone or gravel to make them more stable during heavy use. Travelers who moved along such roads for long distances could benefit from footwear that protected the feet from repeated contact with hard surfaces. Sandals and leather shoes allowed people to walk farther with less discomfort while carrying goods or messages between settlements. Over time, these patterns of movement strengthened the practical value of footwear within expanding human networks. At the same time, cultural expectations surrounding public appearance began to evolve in certain societies. In urban centers where trade and governance created formal spaces of interaction, clothing and accessories sometimes reflected social identity. Footwear could become part of this broader expression. Different styles of sandals or shoes might be associated with particular professions, social roles, or regional traditions. While these customs varied widely across cultures, they contributed to the growing visibility of footwear in public life. Yet even as shoes became more common in urban settings, the deeper biological history of the human foot remained unchanged. The structure of the foot had formed during a much earlier period when natural terrain shaped every step. The bones, muscles, and sensory systems of the foot still reflected that ancient design. What had changed was the environment surrounding the body. Cities introduced surfaces that were harder, more uniform, and increasingly separated from the natural landscapes where the human species first learned to walk. As this transformation unfolded, footwear gradually became part of the new relationship between humans and the ground they moved across each day. As urban environments continued to expand, the surfaces people walked upon became increasingly shaped by human construction rather than natural processes. Streets were reinforced to support constant movement, and buildings created enclosed spaces where the ground was replaced by wooden floors, stone tiles, or other materials. In such settings, daily movement began to occur within environments that were more controlled and predictable than the landscapes of earlier human history. The ground beneath the feet was no longer soil that changed with weather or vegetation that bent under pressure. Instead, it became part of the built environment designed to remain stable through time. These surfaces introduced a different physical experience for the human body. Natural ground often absorbs some of the force created during walking. Soil compresses slightly, grass softens the impact of a step, and sand shifts in response to weight. Hard urban surfaces behave differently. Stone, brick, and wood return more of that force back through the foot and leg. Over long periods of walking, this repeated impact can become noticeable, especially when carrying goods or traveling across busy streets. Footwear offered a practical response to these conditions. By placing a layer of material between the foot and the surface, shoes could reduce friction and soften the contact created by each step. In growing cities, another factor began to influence the use of footwear: the density of human activity. Markets, workshops, and crowded streets meant that many people and animals shared the same spaces throughout the day. Dust, waste, and fragments of materials could accumulate on the ground as a result of daily life. Shoes helped create a barrier between the foot and these surfaces, making it easier to move through busy environments without constant discomfort. This practical advantage became increasingly important as urban populations expanded and movement through public spaces intensified. Trade and long-distance travel also contributed to the rising importance of footwear. Merchants, messengers, and travelers often spent extended periods walking along established routes that connected cities and regions. These journeys sometimes required crossing long stretches of paved or compacted ground designed to support carts and animals. Although such roads made travel more efficient, they also exposed the feet to repeated contact with hard surfaces. Sandals and leather shoes helped distribute the pressure created by long hours of walking, allowing travelers to move more comfortably across these routes. Over time, these patterns reinforced the role of footwear as a useful companion for movement through both urban environments and trade networks. Cultural habits gradually adjusted to these changing conditions. In some communities, wearing shoes in public became increasingly common as part of everyday dress. At the same time, traditions of removing footwear inside homes or certain buildings often continued. These practices maintained a balance between the outside world of constructed streets and the interior spaces where bare feet might still touch the floor. The result was a daily rhythm in which people moved repeatedly between environments that encouraged footwear and spaces where it was set aside. Through these changes, the relationship between the human foot and the ground continued to evolve. The body itself remained shaped by a much older evolutionary history, in which direct contact with natural terrain was normal. Yet the surfaces created by expanding cities gradually introduced new conditions for walking. Footwear became one way that human societies adapted to these environments, marking another step in the long transition from a world of natural landscapes to one increasingly defined by human construction. As cities became more organized and permanent, the materials used to shape human environments continued to change. Roads were strengthened to handle increasing traffic from carts, animals, and travelers. Buildings were constructed from stone, brick, or wood, creating surfaces that remained firm and stable across long periods of time. Within these environments, daily movement no longer depended on the shifting textures of soil or grass. Instead, it took place across surfaces designed to resist change. The ground beneath human feet was gradually becoming part of the built world rather than the natural one. This transformation influenced how people experienced walking in subtle ways. Natural landscapes often contain irregular surfaces that encourage careful movement. Slight variations in soil, vegetation, or rock invite the body to adjust its balance with each step. Constructed environments tend to reduce these variations. Streets, courtyards, and floors are created to remain level and predictable. While this stability made movement easier in crowded spaces, it also meant that the body encountered fewer changes in texture beneath the feet. Walking across stone streets or wooden floors often produced a consistent pattern of impact with every step. Over long distances, this repetition could place steady pressure on the foot and leg. Footwear gradually became a practical way to manage these new conditions. Sandals and shoes placed a layer of flexible material between the body and the hardened surfaces of urban life. This layer could soften the contact created by repeated steps while also protecting the skin from rough edges or small fragments of debris. In busy cities where many people moved through shared spaces each day, shoes also helped shield the foot from dirt and waste that could collect on streets and public pathways. These practical advantages encouraged the regular use of footwear in environments where constructed surfaces dominated daily movement. The growth of trade networks reinforced this shift. Merchants traveling between cities often walked along roads built to support heavy use. These routes allowed goods to move across long distances but also exposed travelers to extended contact with firm ground. Over time, the repeated impact of walking along such paths made protective footwear increasingly valuable. Sandals made from woven fibers or leather shoes shaped to the foot became useful tools for those who spent long hours traveling between settlements. In this way, expanding networks of commerce gradually strengthened the connection between urban life and the use of footwear. Cultural expectations also evolved alongside these changes. In many societies, clothing began to reflect the environments in which people lived and worked. Shoes became a visible part of public appearance in certain communities, especially within cities where large numbers of people interacted daily. At the same time, traditional customs often preserved moments when footwear was removed, such as inside homes or sacred spaces. These practices maintained a link to older habits in which bare feet remained part of everyday experience. Even as footwear became more common in public life, the memory of direct contact between the human body and the ground persisted within these cultural traditions. When viewed across the long timeline of human history, this transformation represents a relatively recent development. For most of the time since our species first appeared, humans walked across landscapes shaped by natural forces rather than by human construction. The rise of cities, roads, and permanent infrastructure gradually introduced new surfaces beneath human feet. With them came a growing reliance on footwear, marking another stage in the slow separation between the human body and the natural ground that had once been touched directly with every step. In the modern world, many people spend most of their time walking across surfaces that would have been unfamiliar to the earliest humans. Streets are paved with stone, asphalt, or concrete. Buildings contain floors made from wood, tile, or other manufactured materials. Sidewalks guide the movement of pedestrians through cities, and indoor spaces create environments where the ground rarely resembles natural terrain. Within these settings, footwear has become such a regular part of daily life that many individuals rarely walk barefoot outside of their homes. This routine can make it easy to forget how recently this separation between foot and earth appeared in the long story of human history. For the vast majority of our species' existence, the ground beneath the feet was part of the natural landscape. Soil, sand, grass, and rock formed the surfaces people encountered while moving across the land. Each of these surfaces carried subtle variations that the body could sense and respond to. The human foot developed within that environment. Its structure reflects a long evolutionary history shaped by direct contact with the ground. When modern footwear adds layers of rubber, leather, or synthetic material between skin and soil, it creates a different sensory experience than the one our ancestors knew for hundreds of thousands of years. One of the changes introduced by modern environments involves the reduction of sensory feedback from the ground. The sole of the human foot contains many nerve endings that detect pressure, temperature, and movement. These signals help the body adjust balance and posture while walking. When thick soles or cushioned shoes are worn, some of this information becomes less noticeable. The body still maintains balance, but the details of the surface beneath the feet may become more distant. Instead of responding directly to the texture of soil or stone, the foot often interacts with the interior surface of a shoe. This shift is subtle, yet it represents a change in how the body communicates with the environment during movement. Another difference appears in the variety of surfaces encountered during daily life. Natural terrain rarely remains perfectly uniform. Grass, soil, and sand each respond differently to the weight of the body. Walking across such landscapes encourages small adjustments in the muscles of the foot and leg. Constructed surfaces, however, tend to remain more consistent. A paved sidewalk or indoor floor offers a similar level of hardness with each step. Over time, this consistency changes the rhythm of walking compared with movement across varied natural ground. Footwear works together with these surfaces to create a new pattern of interaction between the body and the built environment. Modern life has also altered the distance between humans and the landscapes where our species first evolved. Many people now spend large portions of their time indoors or within urban spaces where natural ground is rarely encountered. Parks and natural areas still exist, but they often represent only small portions of the environments people move through each day. As a result, the experience of direct contact between the foot and the earth has become less common in many parts of the world. This change does not necessarily mean that something essential has been lost. Instead, it reflects the transformation of human environments through technology, architecture, and social organization. When viewed across the deep timeline of human history, however, it reminds us that the everyday conditions of modern life represent only a brief chapter. The human foot, with its arches, bones, and sensory systems, developed during a much longer era when walking barefoot across natural landscapes was the ordinary condition of human existence. As modern environments became increasingly constructed, the experience of walking began to change in ways that were subtle but widespread. Streets, buildings, and transportation systems gradually reshaped the daily paths people followed. Instead of moving primarily across fields, forests, or open land, many individuals began traveling along routes defined by pavement, sidewalks, and indoor corridors. These surfaces were designed to remain consistent and durable under constant use. While they made movement through crowded spaces more efficient, they also created a different relationship between the human body and the ground beneath it. In natural landscapes, the ground responds to weather and time. Soil softens after rain, grass grows and bends beneath the foot, and sand shifts with each step. These changes create a wide range of textures that the body senses through the feet. Walking across such terrain encourages small adjustments in balance and movement. The toes spread slightly, muscles shift to maintain stability, and the body responds to variations in slope or surface. Constructed environments, by contrast, reduce much of this variation. A sidewalk remains firm regardless of the weather, and indoor flooring is designed to stay level and predictable. These surfaces create a steady rhythm of movement where each step encounters nearly the same resistance. Footwear adds another layer to this transformation. Modern shoes often include materials designed to cushion impact or support the foot during long periods of walking or standing. Rubber soles, foam layers, and other materials soften the contact between the body and the ground. These features provide comfort in environments dominated by hard surfaces. At the same time, they reduce the amount of sensory information that reaches the foot from the terrain beneath it. The body continues to move efficiently, but the direct awareness of the ground becomes less noticeable than it might be during barefoot walking on natural surfaces. This shift has occurred gradually alongside the growth of modern cities and technologies. Transportation systems now allow people to travel long distances without walking at all. Vehicles carry individuals across paved roads, and buildings connect interior spaces through elevators and corridors. As a result, the amount of time many people spend walking outdoors has changed compared with earlier periods of history. The foot remains an important part of human mobility, but it now operates within environments very different from those that shaped its original design. Despite these changes, the structure of the human foot still reflects its long evolutionary past. The arch continues to support the body's weight, the toes assist in balance, and the skin of the sole retains its capacity to sense pressure and texture. These features developed during a time when the human body interacted directly with the ground in a wide variety of natural settings. Modern footwear and constructed surfaces have introduced new conditions, but they have not altered the underlying anatomy that formed over hundreds of thousands of years. When we compare these two worlds, the natural landscapes of early human history and the built environments of modern life, we begin to see how recently this transition occurred. The majority of human experience unfolded in settings where the ground beneath the feet was shaped by nature rather than by human engineering. The spread of cities, roads, and modern footwear has created a different environment for walking, one that places a greater distance between the human body and the earth that once defined the everyday path of our species. In many modern environments, the connection between the human foot and the natural ground has become less visible than it once was. Cities continue to grow, and daily life often unfolds inside buildings, on paved streets, or along carefully designed pathways. Floors are constructed from materials chosen for durability and cleanliness. Sidewalks guide the movement of pedestrians along planned routes. Even parks and gardens are frequently shaped by human design, with paths that separate visitors from the surrounding soil or vegetation. Within these environments, the human foot still performs its familiar role of supporting the body during walking, yet the surfaces it encounters have changed in important ways. For most people today, footwear is worn almost continuously during time spent outside the home. Shoes provide comfort, protection, and sometimes a sense of personal style. They also form a layer between the foot and the ground that softens impact and shields the skin from rough surfaces. In environments where the ground consists of concrete, asphalt, or stone, this protection can be useful. The materials used in modern construction are often harder and less forgiving than the natural soil or grass that early humans walked upon. Footwear helps the body adapt to these conditions by absorbing some of the pressure created during movement. Yet the presence of this protective layer also changes how the foot experiences the ground beneath it. The sole of the foot contains many sensory receptors that detect subtle changes in pressure and texture. These signals help the body maintain balance and adjust posture while walking. When thick soles or cushioned materials separate the skin from the ground, some of this sensory feedback becomes less direct. The body continues to move effectively, but the small variations in surface texture that once guided each step become less noticeable. Instead of sensing the ground itself, the foot often interacts primarily with the interior surface of the shoe. Over time, these conditions have shaped the everyday experience of walking for many people. Natural landscapes still exist, and some individuals continue to walk barefoot in certain settings such as beaches, gardens, or indoor spaces. However, the majority of movement in modern societies takes place within environments designed to reduce irregularities in the ground. Smooth floors, paved roads, and engineered surfaces create predictable pathways that support large populations and complex transportation systems. These environments reflect the remarkable ability of human societies to reshape the world according to practical needs. At the same time, they illustrate how far daily life has moved from the conditions in which the human body first evolved. When we look back across the long history of our species, the contrast becomes striking. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans walked across landscapes shaped entirely by natural forces. Soil, sand, grass, and rock formed the surfaces beneath their feet. Shoes were rare or absent, and the body experienced the ground directly through the skin of the sole. Only during the most recent chapters of human history did the widespread use of footwear and the growth of constructed environments begin to create a consistent barrier between foot and earth. This transformation does not erase the deeper history of the human body. The structure of the foot still carries the marks of that ancient relationship with the land. Each arch, bone, and ligament reflects a long evolutionary past during which walking barefoot across natural terrain was the ordinary condition of human life. When we step back and look across the full span of human history, one quiet pattern becomes easier to notice. For most of the time since our species first appeared, the human body moved through landscapes that had not yet been reshaped by cities, paved roads, or manufactured materials. The ground beneath human feet was soil, sand, grass, stone, or forest floor. These surfaces were created by wind, rain, plants, and geological forces rather than by human design. Walking across them required balance, attention, and a body capable of adapting to subtle variations in the terrain. The human foot developed within exactly these conditions, forming a structure well suited to steady movement across natural ground. In that long period of time, the contact between the foot and the earth was direct. Each step allowed the body to sense the surface beneath it. Pressure shifted through the heel, arch, and toes as the foot responded to the changing ground. The soles of the feet gradually adapted to repeated contact with the landscape. Muscles, ligaments, and bones worked together to support the body through countless steps taken during daily life. Movement across the land was not unusual or extraordinary. It was simply part of how humans survived, traveled, and explored the environments around them. As human societies changed, new layers gradually appeared between the body and the ground. Simple sandals and leather coverings emerged in response to particular climates and terrains. Later, towns and cities introduced streets made of stone or other durable materials. Over time, footwear became more common as people moved through environments shaped increasingly by human construction. These changes unfolded slowly across centuries, influenced by trade, architecture, and cultural habits rather than by a single invention. The result was a gradual shift in how humans experienced the surfaces beneath their feet. Yet even as this transformation occurred, the underlying biology of the human foot remained tied to a much older history. The arches, joints, and sensory systems of the foot evolved long before paved streets or modern shoes existed. These structures formed in a world where walking barefoot across natural ground was the ordinary condition of human life. The foot still carries that history today, even when it spends much of its time inside shoes or walking across constructed surfaces. When we reflect on this long story, the phrase that inspired this journey begins to make more sense. The idea that most of human history was spent barefoot does not describe a single culture or moment in time. Instead, it reflects the enormous stretch of years during which the human body moved across landscapes without the constant use of footwear. Only during the more recent chapters of civilization did shoes become a regular part of daily movement in many societies. Measured against the deep timeline of human existence, that shift occupies only a small fraction of the story. Seen from this wider perspective, the human relationship with the ground beneath our feet becomes something more than a simple detail of everyday life. It becomes a reminder of where our species began. Long before cities, long before roads, and long before the invention of modern shoes, humans walked across the earth step by step, guided by the landscapes that surrounded them. When we consider the long history of the human foot, it becomes clear that this small part of the body carries a story that stretches across immense periods of time. The structure of the foot was not created for the modern world of pavement and footwear. It formed gradually through generations that moved across natural ground shaped by climate and geography. The arch, the alignment of the toes, and the sensitivity of the sole all reflect an evolutionary past in which the foot served as a direct connection between the human body and the landscapes where our species lived. Each step taken by early humans was part of a quiet exchange between skin and soil. The ground provided information through texture, slope, and pressure. The body responded by adjusting balance and posture. Over thousands of years, this interaction became so familiar that it rarely required conscious attention. Walking was simply part of the rhythm of life. People traveled across plains, followed rivers, crossed forests, and moved between seasonal camps with feet that were adapted to the surfaces beneath them. The landscapes changed from place to place, yet the basic relationship between the foot and the earth remained remarkably consistent. As human societies grew more complex, new environments gradually appeared. Settlements expanded, roads connected distant communities, and cities introduced surfaces designed for stability and durability. Footwear evolved alongside these changes, offering protection and comfort in settings where the ground had become harder or more crowded. Over time, shoes became a familiar part of daily life in many cultures. They protected the foot from sharp objects, harsh temperatures, and the repeated impact of walking across constructed surfaces. These developments represent the remarkable ability of human societies to reshape their surroundings in response to practical needs. Yet the deeper biological design of the human foot did not change during this transition. The bones, ligaments, and muscles that support walking today are largely the same as those that carried early humans across ancient landscapes. The sensory system within the sole still has the ability to detect pressure and subtle variations in surface. These features remind us that the body retains traces of a much older environment, one in which the ground itself was felt directly through every step. When we place modern life beside that earlier history, the contrast becomes easier to see. Today, many people spend most of their time within buildings or traveling along paved streets. Footwear is often worn automatically whenever someone leaves the house. These habits feel normal because they are part of the environments humans have built over the past few centuries. Yet measured against the long arc of human existence, this way of moving through the world is relatively recent. For most of the time since our species first appeared, the human body experienced the ground in a more immediate way. Reflecting on this difference does not require returning to the past or abandoning the tools of modern life. Instead, it offers a quiet reminder of the deep history carried within the human body. The feet that support us today are the result of countless generations that walked across natural landscapes long before modern cities existed. Each step taken in the present still relies on that ancient design, shaped during a time when the human journey across the earth unfolded barefoot beneath the open sky. If we follow the story of the human foot all the way back to its beginnings, we eventually arrive at a simple image: a person walking across open land, placing one step after another on soil that has never been shaped by roads or buildings. The ground may be warm under sunlight or cool in the early morning. It may be firm, soft, or slightly uneven. Yet the body moves through this landscape with quiet familiarity, guided by the design that developed over countless generations of life on Earth. For most of the time that humans have existed, this scene was not unusual. It was simply the ordinary condition of being human. The long history we have explored reveals how deeply this connection between the foot and the ground is woven into our past. The human body evolved in landscapes where natural surfaces shaped every step. Grasslands, forests, riverbanks, and coastal paths formed the environments in which our ancestors traveled, searched for food, and slowly spread across continents. The foot developed arches that helped distribute weight, toes that stabilized balance, and sensitive skin that detected subtle changes in terrain. These features did not appear for a world of pavement and sidewalks. They formed in response to the varied textures of the natural earth. Over thousands of years, human societies began to transform their surroundings. Villages grew into towns, and towns into cities. Roads were built, buildings rose from stone and wood, and footwear gradually became more common as people adapted to the environments they created. Shoes offered protection and comfort within these new settings, especially where surfaces became harder or more crowded. These changes represent an important part of human ingenuity. They show how communities learned to shape the world around them in order to support larger populations and more complex ways of life. Yet when viewed across the deep timeline of human history, these developments remain relatively recent. For most of our species' existence, the human journey across the earth unfolded without constant footwear. Bare feet carried people through landscapes shaped entirely by natural forces. The human foot itself still reflects that ancient history. Its structure has not been redesigned for modern cities. Instead, it carries the memory of a much older relationship with the land beneath it. Recognizing this history does not require rejecting the tools and comforts of modern life. Shoes, roads, and buildings have allowed human societies to thrive in ways that would have been impossible in the distant past. But understanding the deeper origins of the human body can offer a quiet sense of perspective. It reminds us that beneath the layers of culture and technology, the human form still carries traces of the environments where our story began. The feet that support us today were shaped by generations that walked across soil, grass, and stone long before the first cities appeared. Each step we take continues to rely on that ancient design, even if the ground beneath us has changed. In this way, the history of walking barefoot becomes more than a detail of the past. It becomes a reminder that the human body and the earth once shared a closer relationship than many people experience today. Our species has traveled a long path from those early landscapes, building civilizations and reshaping the world along the way. Yet somewhere beneath the layers of modern life, the memory of that earlier connection remains quietly present in the structure of the human foot itself. And when we consider that long journey from the open ground of ancient landscapes to the paved streets of modern cities, one final thought gently remains. After hundreds of thousands of years of walking barefoot across the earth, what might the human body still remember about the ground beneath its feet?